It was the kind of silence you don't forget, the kind that presses against your ribs like grief itself. Mason Carter stood alone in the front row of the Pine Brook funeral home, the only mourner present for the woman who had raised him in every way that mattered. The hum of the old furnace, the faint strains of Amazing Grace from the chapel speakers, and the occasional shifting of the funeral director's shoes were the only sounds that filled the room. Mason kept his eyes on the casket, its surface polished but plain, adorned only with white lilacs, Grandma Rose's favorite. His hand rested on a worn leather photo album he'd pulled from her nightstand the day she passed. The rest of the family? Nowhere. Not his high-powered Portish sister, not his money-chasing uncle, not even the cousin who used to call Grandma's second mom. He had the texts to prove it. Stuck in LA traffic. Sorry, I can't fly in on such short notice. Gas prices, you know. And the worst from Lauren, his sister. Let's be real, Mason. She barely knew who we were at the end. Nobody's going to miss work for a woman who forgot our names. That one stung. When the pastor asked if he should begin, Mason simply nodded. The ceremony was brief, impersonal. How could it not be? The man had never met her. But Mason stayed behind. After the hymn faded and the pastor left, he approached the casket alone. He placed his palm gently on the wood and whispered, "I'm here, Grandma. I remember, and I promise." Later, at the cemetery, he watched the coffin lower into the earth while snow began to fall, soft, steady, and unbothered, just like her. No speeches, no tears from those who should have cared, just Mason, a funeral director, and 2 groundskeepers ready to go home. But Mason wasn't going anywhere yet, not until he kept the last promise he ever made her, to make sure her story didn't end in silence. Mason was 8 the first time he was shipped off to Pine Brook for the summer. His parents had framed it as a punishment, said the fresh mountain air might toughen him up, making less soft. But what they didn't understand was that those summers with Grandma Rose were the only time he ever felt truly seen. Her small log cabin, nestled between whispering aspens and wildflower meadows, became a sanctuary. While his peers were at sports camps or glued to video games, Mason spent his days learning how to grow tomatoes from seed, how to split wood properly, and how to listen to the land, to himself, and most of all, to her. Rose wasn't the sugar-eating, baking kind of grandmother. She was sharp, sarcastic, and fiercely independent. She read poetry aloud in the evenings, challenged him with questions about the stars, and made him earn his keep through real chores. "You don't become strong by avoiding discomfort," she'd say, handing him a shovel. "You grow roots by digging deep." Over time, Mason began to understand that Rose wasn't just giving him busy work. She was teaching him to build a life, not just live one. She showed him how to repair tools instead of replacing them. She taught him that solitude wasn't loneliness and that quiet work could be sacred. They'd sit on her creaky front porch, sipping lemonade, and she'd recite lines from Mary Oliver or Wendell Berry like scripture. She even let him carve his name into the side of her old wooden beehive, said it was a promise to the land that he'd come back one day. By the time Mason left for college, he wasn't the same boy his parents had packed off years before. He wasn't loud or flashy like the rest of the Carters, but he was solid, grounded. And Rose, she didn't just raise him, she rooted him. In memory, in meaning, in something real. And now that she was gone, those lessons weren't just memories, they were marching orders. In the final years of Grandma Rose's life, as her memory began to fade and her hands grew too shaky to tend the garden, Mason made sure she was never alone. He adjusted his work schedule, took on fewer clients at his eco-design firm, and moved into a small rental just 10 minutes from her cabin. The rest of the family? They disappeared into excuses. Uncle Dennis hadn't visited in over 2 years. Aunt Martha only called when she needed photos for holiday cards, and Lauren, his sister, offered to send someone to check on Rose, but never showed herself. They'd all written her off, seeing only the fragile shell and forgetting the force of nature she once was. But Mason remembered. He remembered the woman who could still quote Frost and Dickinson from memory, even when she couldn't remember where she'd put her keys. He remembered the sharp glint in her eyes when she warned him, "People who only value what can be counted are usually bankrupt in every way that matters." During one of her last lucid afternoons, she had looked at him, her gaze clearer than it had been in weeks. "When I go," she whispered, "check the old Whitman. Bottom shelf, red spine." He nodded, confused but curious. After the funeral, he returned to the cabin. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sun as he knelt by her bookcase and pulled out a weathered copy. A brass key was taped to the front, along with a note in her unmistakable handwriting. "For the vault at Pine Brook first. You'll know what to do with what you find. And don't tell them yet. Let them show you who they really are first." The bank vault was tucked behind a thick steel door in the basement of Pine Brook First National, a place Mason had walked past his entire childhood without ever noticing. When the manager unlocked it and slid open the drawer, Mason stared in disbelief. Inside were neat stacks of documentation, financial statements, investment portfolios, deed records, and a sealed letter addressed simply, "To my family," but it was the cover page that took his breath away. His grandmother, Rose Carter, was worth over $37 million, 0 cents. Mason blinked, his mind trying to bridge the gap between the woman who baked her own bread to save money and the reality of these flourishing investments. It all made sense now. Her early interest in wind energy, her obsession with sustainable agriculture companies, long before they hit the market, even her land, hundreds of acres she'd refused to sell to developers, had quadrupled in value. She had lived modestly, not because she had to, but because she chose to. Along with the documents was a USB drive and a handwritten instruction sheet. "You are the executor," it began. "Not because you're perfect, but because you stayed. You listened. You showed up. The others, well, I still love them, but love doesn't mean they go untested." The instructions were clear. Mason was to arrange private meetings with each family member and reveal only small pieces of the estate. Only those who demonstrated character, reflection, or genuine care would be considered for the full inheritance. Mason's hands trembled as he held the papers. This wasn't just about money. This was Rose's final lesson, her way of holding up a mirror to the people who had taken her for granted. And now it was Mason's responsibility to carry it out, to protect her legacy, not just from the outside world, but from the family itself. And he would, because the only thing more valuable than what she left behind was why she left it the way she did. Uncle Dennis arrived at the cabin 2 days after the funeral, not with flowers or condolences, but with a real estate brochure and a forced smile. Here the place might be worth a good chunk now that the resort's planning expansion, he said, stepping inside without an invitation. Mason didn't flinch. He'd been expecting this. Dennis, with his expensive cologne and cufflinks that screamed midlife crisis, had always seen Rose's land as a missed opportunity, prime for development, if only she'd gotten with the times. He paced the living room like he owned it, already talking about permits, buyers, and quick flips. Mason let him ramble, then handed over a sealed envelope with Dennis's name in Rose's handwriting. Inside was a short letter, a land grant agreement, and one condition. Dennis could access a $1 million 0 cents share of the estate, but only if he used it to create a nonprofit housing project for low-income families in Pine Brook, and he had to personally oversee construction and live on site during Phase 1. Dennis laughed, waiting for the punchline. When it didn't come, his jaw tightened. "You're serious? She left me a damn homework assignment?" Mason met his stare. She left you a second chance. Dennis fumed, muttering about being manipulated from the grave. But Mason didn't back down. You always said you could build dreams, he said evenly. This is your shot. The question is, do you still care about anything besides your bank account? For the first time in a long while, Dennis didn't have a snappy answer. He took the envelope and left without another word. Mason watched him pull out of the driveway, the brochure forgotten on the table. It was the first test, and so far, the results were mixed. Martha arrived in Pinebrook the following week, sweeping into Rose's cabin like she was stepping onto a photo set. Dressed in flowing designer layers and oversized sunglasses, she carried a tote bag that said Boss Queen and wore her grief like a fashion statement, carefully curated and camera-read. I wanted to pay my respects, she said, though her phone buzzed every few minutes with notifications from her lifestyle blog. Mason handed her a small velvet pouch and a note from Rose, watching her expression shift from mild curiosity to confusion as she unwrapped a vintage pearl necklace, one that had belonged to their great-grandmother. Along with it came a letter. Martha, you always knew how to draw attention. Now, let's see if you can use it for something lasting. These books and heirlooms are yours, but only if you use them to start a weekly reading program for underserved children. Read aloud. Martha blinked. You're joking. Me? Story time? With kids? She laughed, then paused when Mason pulled a second package from the drawer, a rare, signed first edition of To Kill a Mockingbird, carefully preserved. Her eyes widened. She knew its value, both sentimental and financial. Mason offered no lecture, only said, It's not a punishment. She just wanted you to remember that words matter more than likes. Over the next few weeks, photos quietly appeared on Martha's private Instagram. No filters, no hashtags, just images of her reading to kids on a rug in a crowded community center. One post said, Didn't expect this to move me, but it did. Mason didn't comment, but he noticed. Lauren didn't even bother hiding her impatience. She showed up in a sleek black rental car, stepped out in heels far too polished for mountain gravel, and immediately asked, So, what's the bottom line? Mason didn't flinch. He handed her a formal letter from Rose's estate and watched her scan the contents with practiced speed. Her brow twitched. Volunteer work? You've got to be kidding me. The letter explained that Lauren was entitled to a $4 million 0-cents trust, but only after she completed 1 full year of weekly service at Evergreen Pines Senior Center, the same facility where Rose spent her final months. You told me you were too busy to visit, Rose had written. Now I'm asking you to find the time. Lauren scoffed. What does filing paperwork for a bunch of retirees prove? Mason replied quietly, Maybe it's not about proving anything. Maybe it's about being human. She rolled her eyes, muttering something about manipulation from beyond the grave, but tucked the letter into her designer bag. 3 weeks later, Mason received a call from the director at Evergreen Pines. Lauren had shown up late, distant, and clearly uncomfortable, but she'd come. For the first month, she did the bare minimum, replying to residents with clipped politeness. Then something shifted. One afternoon, an elderly woman named Marlene handed Lauren a faded note Rose had left behind. That was the beginning. Slowly, Lauren started showing up early. She began remembering names, refilling coffee cups, and even staying after hours to help organize old photo albums. She didn't post about it. She didn't brag. But she stayed. And to Mason, that said more than any bank statement ever could. Rose hadn't just left them money. She'd left them mirrors. Chase Carter showed up with his hoodie pulled low, earbuds in, and that same cocky smirk he'd worn since high school. So, he said, hands in his pockets, What'd the old lady leave me? A lecture? Mason didn't say a word, just handed him a manila envelope and a set of keys. Inside was a faded photo of Chase as a boy, sitting in Rose's lap beside her beloved 1968 Ford F-100. the same truck that now sat gathering dust in the barn. The note was simple. You always said you wanted to fix things. Here's your shot. Restore the truck. But you don't do it alone. Bring the Pinebrook High shop kids along for the ride. At first, Chase rolled his eyes. She really left me homework? But curiosity got the better of him. That weekend, he opened the garage door, pushed the truck out into the light, and popped the hood. It was worse than he thought, but he liked the challenge. Within days, he contacted the school, and a few skeptical teens started showing up with greasy hands and big questions. Something changed in Chase. For the first time, he wasn't just tinkering, he was teaching. He showed them how to rebuild, how to respect tools, and how to take pride in small progress. And slowly, the truck and Chase started coming back to life. Mason drove by one afternoon and saw them laughing under the lifted hood, oil-streaked and proud. Rose had known. Redemption doesn't need applause, just purpose. The last letter in the estate packet was addressed to Mason himself. No conditions, no tests, just a note in Rose's graceful handwriting. This land is yours now, not to keep, but to share. You already passed the only test that mattered. You stayed. Mason stood on the porch of the home he'd once helped her shingle, the wind brushing through the aspens like an old friend whispering, "Welcome back." He could have sold it, developed it, cashed in on the rising land value, like so many others in town were doing, but he didn't. Instead, he rolled out plans for a community greenhouse using his eco-design skills. He partnered with the local school to offer outdoor education programs and began restoring the trail Rose had once walked daily. He turned the old barn into a creative studio for local kids, a place for building and dreaming, just like she did for him. One morning, the townspeople gathered to unveil a mural painted on the side of the cabin's tool shed. It was Rose, seated in her wicker chair with her wild gray curls and her ever-present book in hand. Above her, in bold brushstrokes, were the words, "Legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's who you build along the way." Mason stood quietly among the crowd, hands in his pockets, heart full. This wasn't just a home anymore, it was a living tribute, and every sunflower blooming in her garden, every child laughing on her land, every story read aloud under her trees, it was all proof that Rose Carter was still here, just in a different form. A year to the day after Rose Carter's quiet funeral, her cabin in Pinebrook was anything but quiet. Laughter echoed from the porch, the garden overflowed with color, and for the first time in decades, the Carter family wasn't just in the same place, they were present. Mason stood by the trellis gate, watching as cars pulled into the gravel driveway, one by one. Lauren stepped out first, dressed simply, no heels, her hair tight. She smiled, an actual unforced smile, as she carried a tray of lemon bars made from Rose's old recipe. Martha arrived next, hand in hand with two kids from her reading group who ran straight for the swing set. Chase pulled up in the restored truck, the engine purring proudly, his students from the auto program cheering as they jumped from the bed. Even Dennis came, less polished than usual, his button-up rolled at the sleeves. He didn't bring blueprints, he brought stories from the community housing project that, surprisingly, he now considered the best thing. They gathered under the pergola. Rose planted herself, string lights dancing in the twilight. Mason stood beside a wooden plaque newly installed at the garden gate. It read, "In memory of Rose Carter, who taught us to grow more than just roots." Glasses were raised, not to money. Mason looked around at his once fractured family and whispered to himself, "You did it, Grandma. They remember now." As the sun dipped behind the mountains and the last of the laughter faded into fireflies and night air, Mason sat alone on the porch, just like he used to with Grandma Rose. Only now, the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt full of stories, growth, redemption. He thought back to the funeral a year ago when he stood as the only one who showed up, heartbroken and determined. So much had changed since then, not because of money, but because of the way it was given. Rose hadn't left behind a fortune, she'd left behind a mirror, one that forced each of them to see who they were and decide who they wanted to become. What she gave them wasn't just inheritance, it was intention, the kind that doesn't measure wealth by what's hoarded, but by what's handed forward. Mason saw it now in Lauren's gentler tone, in Martha's quiet confidence, in Chase's new discipline, and even in Dennis's humbled posture. Her legacy lived in their choices, not in their bank accounts. Mason stood, walking slowly to the garden. He reached down and touched the lavender bushes she once called her living prayers. The scent rose up like memory. He smiled. Grandma Rose taught them that value isn't in what you leave behind, it's in the people you help grow. And in doing so, she didn't just change their inheritance, she changed their future. And Mason, he would never forget again. And now, neither would they. This story reminds us that legacy isn't measured by dollars or property, it's defined by the impact we leave on the people around us. Rose Carter didn't just pass down wealth, she passed down wisdom. She challenged her family to confront who they had become and offered them the opportunity to become better. Through intentional love, tough lessons, and quiet resilience, she reshaped her family's future long after she was gone. We often chase success, status, and recognition, but forget the true value of presence, showing up, listening, remembering the people who helped shape us. Mason's journey teaches us that being there when no one else is matters. Sometimes the smallest acts of loyalty and care have the greatest power to spark change. If this story moved you, made you think, or reminded you of someone who always showed up for you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more emotional stories like this about justice, legacy, and the quiet heroes among us, like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a moment. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter.